You're told the Templars left behind everything: their victories, their failures, their grand masters, their charters, their crimes, their triumphs, all meticulously recorded, all dutifully preserved, and yet tucked inside a sealed papal document, you find a whisper of something that should not exist, a hidden chain of command. Men with no titles, no vows, no battlefield legends, no presence in any chronicle. Men who shaped decisions from behind a curtain no historian ever noticed. If the order already terrified kings and popes with what it revealed, imagine the danger of what it concealed. So breathe for a moment. Let the shock settle the way dust settles after a door slams shut in an abandoned hall. The urgency softens, and the tone grows slower, calmer, as if inviting you to step deeper into a quiet room where secrets prefer to speak in low voices. Picture a candlelit archive, the kind that feels much too silent for your own footsteps. Shelves lean under the weight of centuries, yet what draws your attention isn't what's present, but what's missing. You trace your fingers along brittle parchment that should list every Templar commander across Europe. Instead, you find gaps, blank spaces that feel deliberate. You sense how absence can be louder than evidence, how missing names can echo across time with a strange gravity. Historians tend to chase what they can see, but you're standing at the threshold of a story built from everything they couldn't. Redacted ledgers, vanished roles, stray references to men who move like ghosts through correspondence. It is almost comedic. If ghosts filed paperwork, they'd probably do it more consistently. But here the contradictions feel too sharp to ignore. These weren't accidents. These were erasures. As the air cools, you ease into the rhythm of this investigation, knowing that every clue you'll encounter from this moment on will be subtle, fragile, or intentionally hidden. You're not here to dramatize the order or to resurrect old rumors. You're here to trace the silhouettes of the men who commanded without ever being named, whose influence shaped the order's fate yet never appeared on any scroll. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. You start not with a scream, but with a hush, an eerie absence, a kind of silence that doesn't feel like nothing, but rather like something deliberately stripped away. The Templars were infamous for their meticulous record-keeping. Every commandery logged inventories. Every knight's induction was documented. Every order mission blessing and burial was filed, copied, and stored across Europe. Their archive habits were not just bureaucratic, they were a manifestation of spiritual discipline. To serve the divine, they believed, was to keep accounts with precision. Yet in the vast cathedrals of parchment, they left behind something is missing. Or more accurately, someone. You pull records from Provence and Rouen. They mention orders dispatched from commanders whose names you expect to match the Grand Master's register, but they don't. The signatures differ. The tone of the directives feels older, colder, less pious. And as you cross-reference these letters against military movements from the same month, you begin to notice a pattern. Some campaigns, minor ones but not insignificant, appear to have been orchestrated by people who are never identified. Just titles, just instructions, as if the signature were deliberately scrubbed. Of course, some gaps in medieval archives are natural. Rats eat paper, fire eats vaults. But this is different. The missing names appear strategically placed, not random. As though someone tried to erase only certain actors, those who didn't fit the chain of command. What historian Alain de Murger once referred to as lacunae of intent. Gaps created not by time, but by policy. Then there are the redactions. In a preserved ledger from the commandery of La Rochelle, dated to 1278, two entire lines of names have been blacked out, not scraped, but inked over. Why ink over something, unless you knew someone might come looking? Why not simply destroy the document? You wonder if perhaps that's the joke, that hiding something in plain sight beneath a dark line is more intimidating than a flame. It suggests the thing was too dangerous to forget and too dangerous to reveal. There is a curious detail buried in an inquisitorial summary from the trial of Templar treasurer Hugues de Perraud. When questioned about the movement of funds between Cyprus and southern France, he mentions a man who gave no name, but whom all obeyed. The scribe adds a curious note in the margin, not listed among the brethren. A casual observer might dismiss it. A tired clerk might ignore it. But you're not here to read with tired eyes. You're here to follow the fingerprints even when the hands are invisible. What emerges isn't proof yet, but a scent, a presence beneath the official flow. Like a current running against the surface stream, these men, whoever they were, didn't sign their names to documents. They directed others who did. Their footprints are indirect detectable only through the bends they left in otherwise straight lines, like a branch pressed under silk. Scholars have long debated the reasons behind these redactions. Some argue they were acts of humility, anonymous benefactors or non-knightly patrons preferring secrecy. Others lean into the practical covert agents perhaps embedded in diplomatic affairs, too sensitive to risk exposure. Still others whisper about heretical branches, internal reformers, or foreign advisors not officially inducted. But none of these theories fully explain the precision of the deletions. One historian, writing anonymously in the margins of a now-lost letter housed in the British Museum, posed the question more bluntly. What if the order obeyed not one chain of command, but two? That line never made it into formal publication, but it was copied. Quietly. You find it again in a Portuguese codex scrawled in faded ink beside a Templar oath. Almost like someone wanted it preserved, but never spoken aloud. And this perhaps is the true beginning. Not a discovery, but an absence that refuses to remain quiet. You start to ask yourself unsettling questions. If the names are missing across several continents, was it a coincidence? Or was it a design? Were these men deliberately left out of history? Or did they choose the shadows? The next time you look at a map of Templar holdings, something shifts in your perception. You no longer see castles and churches. You see points on a web, a lattice of influence. And in the negative space between the lines, you begin to imagine the hands that pulled them. Because silence in this story is not emptiness. It is architecture. Imagine standing in a hall where every stone represents a rule, every pillar a vow. You study the architecture, admiring its clarity, its balance. But then your eye catches an angle that feels wrong, not crumbling, just deliberately skewed, as if behind the visible structure, there's another shape, one you weren't meant to see. That's what it feels like when you study the official hierarchy of the Knights Templar. On paper, the order was built on discipline. Every rank was defined. The Grand Master ruled from Jerusalem, then from Cyprus or Paris, depending on the century. Below him were the seneschals, marshals, commanders, drapers, and so on. A tidy pyramid precisely recorded. And yet, when you read internal memoranda between distant commanderies, communications from Antioch to Aragon, from Acre to Anjou, you notice decisions that seem to bypass this chain. Not contradict it, just ignore it. Like someone whispering over the shoulder of the man supposedly in charge. There's a curious example from the archives of the Temple Mount Commandery. A dispute arose in 1224 over land rights granted to the Hospitallers. The Grand Master had issued one position, But a conflicting decree arrived from an unnamed source in Marseille, countermanding his decision, and the knights followed that decree instead. No one questioned it. No one annotated it. No one demanded clarification. It was simply accepted, as if the command came from somewhere higher than the highest rank they were willing to write down. This isn't a one-off. You find other cases scattered like strange anomalies across years and continents. A Portuguese outpost suddenly rerouting supplies not because of an order from headquarters, but based on a message labeled only with a crimson sigil, one that doesn't appear in any known heraldic register. A Hungarian commander dismissing his second-in-command, citing instructions from the Brothers of the Veil, a title found nowhere in the Rule of the Temple, not even in its obscure amendments. Now scholars have tried to explain these inconsistencies. Some suggest internal factions. Others point to regional autonomy after all. Not every commander waited for Paris to make decisions. Fair. But the pattern doesn't behave like rogue decentralization. It behaves like deference. Specific outposts defer not to each other or to their superiors, but to a shared but unnamed authority, as if there were a rule behind the rule. One especially odd clue comes from a scroll found in the ruins of a Templar estate in Auvergne. In it, the author describes a ritual in which orders are received not from the Grand Master, but from the line above the circle. The phrasing is poetic, sure, but the context suggests hierarchy. And the scroll is older than most surviving rulebooks. Perhaps it's metaphor. Perhaps it's a memory. A controversial interpretation emerged in the early 20th century when an Italian researcher argued that the Templars operated a silent twin structure, one visible, one hidden. His work was dismissed at the time, partly because he cited no firm sources, and partly because he had a mustache that made him look like a Bond villain. But what stuck was the concept of bifurcated control, where official ranks were merely operational, while actual decision-making flowed through a less visible channel, protected by secrecy and reinforced by ritual. This raises a deeper question. If there was a hidden command structure, how did its members gain authority they couldn't rely on public promotions or formal ceremonies? Which suggests their power was either spiritual, financial, or inherited. And that possibility opens the door to something far stranger, a caste of influence within the order, whose legitimacy didn't depend on earthly titles, but on unseen loyalties. Perhaps even oaths made before initiation or outside the order altogether. And here's where things get uncomfortable, because if the Templars were following a second chain of command, then we're not just dealing with a few missing names. We're dealing with a second order one embedded inside the first, like a shadow inside a flame. You think back to the erased names from the archives, the blacked out ledgers, the marginal notes about unnamed overseers. None of them made sense in isolation. But under this lens, they begin to rhyme. And suddenly, what looked like silence becomes signal. The chain of command may have ended on paper at the Grand Master, but it continued invisibly through voices that never left ink behind. The Knights Templar have always been framed as warriors who bowed to discipline, poverty, and obedience. But maybe, just maybe, some of them bowed to something else, something older, or deeper, or simply unrecorded. And once you begin asking who gave the real orders, you have to wonder who made sure they were never caught giving them. It begins with a letter, faded ink on smooth calfskin, dated 1267, written in Occitan, the tongue of southern France. The handwriting is practiced steady but rushed, like the writer had memorized what not to say aloud. It's addressed to a man named Gerard, known to have been a Templar commander in Béziers. But what makes the letter strange isn't the sender, it's the closing line. I remain as always in service to the second circle. No seal, no title, no name. If that were all, you might dismiss it as poetic flourish. But then you find another. This one in Latin from the archives of a minor outpost near Rhodes. The scribe discusses food shortages, troop rotations, and then casually mentions approval received from the hand beyond Limoges. No one in Limoges held that kind of authority. No one officially acknowledged as a Templar anyway. And again, no sender. Only an abbreviation, IRC. The initials appear in half a dozen other places, always associated with decisions or permissions outside the Grand Master's register. Soon the pattern emerges thin at first, like dust rising from ancient parchment, but unmistakable. Letters from Portugal, Cyprus, Burgundy, even as far north as Denmark. Notes written between commanders referencing unseen authorities. Some even imply correction. Our route has changed by request of the gentle custodian, says one. Another reads, they have retracted the funds. Not from Paris, from the Tower. The Tower. Now that's a term you've heard before, but never with clarity. Most assume it refers to the Templar stronghold in London, or sometimes the temple in Paris. But these letters imply something different. Not a place, but a body. Or a presence. One letter from a Venetian source even describes the tower's voice as if it were a person. Of course, academic historians have long wrestled with epistolary anomalies. The medieval world was flooded with letters. Not every name was logged, not every scribe careful with titles. Clerical sloppiness is real. But when the same phrases, same curious honorifics, and same initials appear across dozens of unrelated documents over a span of 80 years, the defense of coincidence wears thin. One document, however, stands out above the rest. It was recovered from a private collection in Avila in the 1950s, sealed inside a hollow book and nearly destroyed by mildew. It is short, less than 100 words, but chilling. The letter is addressed to a man called Brother Udo. The sender instructs him to delay a transfer of funds until the three give light. No explanation. Just that phrase followed by a tiny deliberate mark in the lower corner, 3 dots arranged in a triangle. You've seen that triangle before. On the inside cover of a Templar ledger housed in Portugal. On a carving in a forgotten commandery near Narbonne. Once even on a silver ring found buried with a knight whose name was erased from the registry. That mark does not belong to the Order of the Temple, not officially, and yet it appears like a watermark on their shadow correspondence. Subtle, persistent, forgotten, or perhaps just made forgettable. Now comes the part where things grow more tangled. Because one of the letters, this one from a Templar outpost in Acre, references an adjustment made by the old sealers. It uses the word vetuli signatores, old signers, a term that appears nowhere in canonical Templar documents. And yet, when matched with the phrase vetulus, which appears in Gnostic texts and even certain Cathar testimonies, the connection begins to ripple. Was this a veiled nod to a parallel spiritual line? A lineage of those who signed what the visible order could not. And here's where the scholars begin to argue. Some insist these are metaphors, poetic, mystical flourishes, meant to conceal simple political directives. Others propose that rogue Templar cells used false authority to justify disobedience. A third camp, notably smaller, dares to suggest that these are the voices of a separate internal council. An invisible board made not of warriors or monks, but of watchers, facilitators, hidden commanders. One historian in Prague published a slim volume in the 1970s, mostly ignored, in which he proposed that the phrase second circle referred to a hidden ring of governance within the order, modeled not on military rank, but on esoteric initiation. In his theory, these men didn't need to appear in ledgers because they were never appointed in the first place. They were chosen, quietly, irrevocably. It's a romantic notion tempting cinematic, and perhaps completely unprovable, but then you return to the letters, dozens of them, inconsistent in ink but consistent in intent. You don't see power flaunted, you see power cloaked. Not a single one demands obedience. They simply state what is to be done, and it is done, without challenge, without delay, without attribution. One letter even ends with a gentle threat, not in words, but in silence. It says, "The road diverges in 3 days. Choose well, brother, for some doors do not reopen." So you ask yourself the same question these letters keep whispering. If these men weren't part of the order's formal structure, and yet they directed its course, who were they? How did they gain the obedience of seasoned knights? And what gave them the authority to leave no name behind? You imagine it like this: a stone chamber warm from torchlight, but cold in its foundations. The kind of place where voices are meant to echo with gravitas. Seated around a worn oak table are men in white mantles, their faces weathered from war and distance. They speak in Latin sometimes, in clipped French, each word weighed. These were chapter meetings, the core governance councils of the Knights Templar. Ritualized, regulated, and supposedly well documented. But every now and then, a voice enters the room that shouldn't be there. The trial records from Paris, those dry but revealing transcriptions from 1307 onward, include fragments of testimony about such meetings. One night, Pierre de Bologna admitted that not all men present at certain assemblies were Templars by name. When pressed on this point, he grew nervous. His scribe notes that he hesitated, then whispered that a man with no cross on his robe gave counsel. Another brother, Amory from Provence, spoke of a quiet one at the back, a man who offered no blessing and bore no sword. Yet when he nodded, decisions shifted. No one named him. No one ever asked who he was. You pause on that detail. A man without a cross on his robe. That alone should have been enough to deny him entry, much less influence. Yet his presence was unchallenged. That's not confusion. That's accommodation. One meeting in Cyprus is particularly telling. The minutes from the council, preserved in a near-complete form, mention a heated dispute between regional commanders over ship allocations. The Grand Master issued one ruling, but the argument stalled until a comment was made from the northern alcove. The phrasing is vague and the scribe makes no effort to identify the speaker. Yet immediately after the argument ceases and the council accepts a new course of action. It's the medieval equivalent of a meeting derailed by a voice from the back of the room, a voice so authoritative that even the Grand Master falls silent. Of course, interpretations vary. Some scholars suggest these unnamed attendees were papal observers quietly dispatched to monitor the order's conduct. Others propose they were financial overseers from associated merchant banks. There's even a theory involving Eastern mystics invited as symbolic guests. But in every scenario, one detail fails to resolve. Why do these figures remain unlisted? Why in institutions obsessed with hierarchy and record-keeping are some voices treated as ghosts? You find another anomaly in a fragment of parchment recovered from the ruins of a Templar house in Toulouse. The meeting log is mundane at first: grain shortages, repair schedules, typical dry logistics. Then a line jumps out, consulted the mirror again. Response came through the gray one. No name, no title, no indication of who or what the gray one might be. And yet, whatever answer was given, it ended the debate. In another preserved witness account, a knight named Benoit described his transfer orders being delayed because the balance had not yet been weighed. The interrogators pressed for clarification. Benoit simply said the men of the balance hadn't spoken. Again, no records of such a position exist. The rule of the order makes no mention of balancers, but Benoit's tone implied familiarity, not mystery, as if this was just part of how things worked, just not officially. The term silent advisors appears in one Flemish translation of Templar proceedings, though its origin is disputed. Some believe it to be a mistranslation of council elders, but others, particularly a German scholar writing in the 1870s, suggest it was a coded reference to men whose opinions shaped doctrine without ever being part of it. His notes were dismissed at the time, possibly because he was also convinced Atlantis was real. But eccentric scholars sometimes trip into the truth by accident, and this particular observation clings to the edges of what you now see. And here, perhaps, is the clearest callback to the earlier anomalies in the letters. Because these silent presences at the meetings behave like the authors of those unsigned commands. Present, powerful, unnamed. Not issuing decrees from afar, but close enough to see the council's expressions change when they speak. It becomes harder to tell whether these figures were tolerated because of their insight or because of fear. No accusations ever arose about them directly. No charges brought forward. They were never burned, never tried. You begin to sense that whatever authority they held, it was accepted not begrudgingly, but instinctively, like old loyalty or ancient debt. There's something else. In 3 unrelated chapter meeting, logs 2 from France, 1 from Sicily, the same odd phrase appears when debate reaches an impasse. We await the blue voice. Strange given the order's symbolism centers on red, white, and black. Blue doesn't belong, and yet in each case decisions were postponed. Sometimes for days, and when they resumed, no written input appears. Just a change of course. So what are you left with? A room full of knights, oaths, rules, ritual, and somewhere at the edge a man without a title, without a cross, whose gaze bends decisions like wind bends flame. He doesn't speak often, but when he does, everyone listens, and no one writes his name. You picture the scene, a dusty courtyard in Antioch early morning, the clatter of hooves against worn flagstones, and a rider in unfamiliar robes dismounting before a Templar gate. His beard is long, his clothing embroidered in a pattern not seen west of Armenia. 2 guards exchange a glance, but do not stop him. He isn't announced. He's expected. When medieval chroniclers describe the inner circle of the Knights Templar, the language is usually rigid. Rank, habit, nationality, each knight categorized, each deviation noted with suspicion. But here and there, like small cracks in a marble statue, anomalies appear. Guest advisors who attended strategy meetings but weren't named. Foreign men observed entering councils but not listed in any record. Silent consultants who arrived just before key decisions were made and disappeared just after. One chronicler from the court of Baldwin the Foreigner writes vaguely of 2 men in black from the east welcomed among the white cloaks at dusk. He doesn't name them. He doesn't elaborate. But it's the first hint that Templar leadership may not have been as insular as it pretended to be. From Jerusalem to Tyre, Templar holdings sat at the crossroads of civilizations. They dealt not only with kings and crusaders, but with caliphs, merchants, mystics, and spies. There are verified accounts of high-ranking Templars dining with Mongol envoys, negotiating with Syrian assassins, and even meeting informally with Druze elders. Most of these interactions were framed as diplomacy, but some suggest more than political convenience. Some hint at trust, at integration. A particularly odd detail arises in a Byzantine letter stored in Thessaloniki, where an official complains that a Latinate knight follows the advice of the one with 2 tongues. Scholars have debated whether this was metaphorical, a poetic jab at duplicity, but the phrase reappears in a Persian manuscript, referring to the Franks' pale swordsman, led by the speaker of two tongues. In that version, the phrase clearly refers to someone bilingual, perhaps someone acting as a go-between, a cultural hinge, someone close enough to the Templars to steer them yet foreign enough to escape the archives. Another source, this one from a Jewish merchant operating in the Levant, notes that during a caravan inspection by Templars in Gaza, an old man in Sufi garb whispered into the ear of the knight who issued final approval. The merchant assumed he was a translator. But what if he wasn't? What if he was there because his opinion mattered not just to the knight, but to the unseen council behind him? Of course, you could dismiss this as medieval multiculturalism. The East was full of strange partnerships, temporary truces, and unexpected friendships. But there's a quiet regularity to these accounts. The foreign guest doesn't just appear once. He appears over and over in different forms, wearing different robes, speaking different languages. He sits just behind the official speaker. He leaves before records are written. One Arabic historian from Aleppo describes a battle near Hama, where the Christians changed formation after meeting with a dark-eyed Roman. The Christian sources for the same event offer no such detail. No Roman is mentioned. No advisor is recorded. But the maneuver happened. Someone changed the plan. This, of course, opens a broader scholarly debate. Was the Templar command structure ever truly closed? Or was there always an unspoken tier made up of informants, sages, defectors, perhaps even mystics, whose influence was tolerated as long as it proved useful? Modern historians are split. Some insist on strict boundaries, only Christians, only knights, only men of the Latin Rite. Others point to the Templars' pragmatism. They needed alliances to survive. They needed knowledge. And if a few decisions were whispered from behind a veil, well, who would be brave enough to question success? One record from Acre refers obliquely to the guest at dawn. No name, no title, just a simple line. No movement until the guest at dawn arrives. In another text from the same year, we see an interesting notation in the margin. He wore no red, no white, no cross. But he spoke and we listened. You recall now the unnamed speaker from the chapter meetings, the letters signed only with cryptic initials, the reference to the second circle. None of these anomalies stand alone. They form a constellation, a pattern. One that suggests these foreign figures weren't just passing through, they were participating, maybe even directing. It's easy to assume that influence only flows from the center outward. But in this case, the center might have been hollow and the current drawn from the periphery. The men in robes without insignia, the guests who never stayed long enough to be noticed, the foreigners who became familiar, even essential. Their names are lost, or maybe they were never written, but their footprints remain pressed into decisions embedded in outcomes. You start to realize that if the Templars were vessels of power, these men were the wind that filled their sails. In the vaulted quiet of the Vatican secret archives, tucked between endless rows of papal decrees and sealed correspondence, lies a peculiar collection of privileges granted to the Knights Templar. Some are expected exemptions from taxation, legal protections, spiritual indulgences. But a few are different. They don't refer to any known master. They are granted to unnamed men described only by function, not identity. And they appear without context, without petition, and without any reciprocal documentation from the Templars themselves. One such privilege, issued under the authority of Pope Innocent IV in 1252, permits the appointed overseers to operate without regional oversight or clerical interference. The Latin phrasing is vague custodibus externis in servitio crucis, external custodians in service of the cross. No names are attached. No known offices match the description. And yet the seal is genuine, the grant unrestricted. These custodians could enter any Templar house audit, any ledger override any commander, and leave no trace of their presence behind. Who they were remains a blank. It's not an isolated case. Another document from Pope Urban IV, dated to 1264, speaks of our trusted carriers of the flame being exempt from jurisdictional disputes in Aragon and Burgundy. Again, no individuals are named. No specific branch of the order is referenced. And yet, the language grants absolute mobility and authority beyond what even most masters would have enjoyed. Templar rule was strict, but it was also layered. Local commanders answered to regional masters, who in turn were subordinate to the Grand Master and the General Chapter. All within the order was supposed to flow upward toward Rome, or at least toward Cyprus and Jerusalem. Yet these papal grants suggest a bypass, a back door, someone operating on behalf of the order but not within it. Of course, medieval exemptions were political tools. Monarchs and popes issued them to curry favor and force obedience or settle disputes. But what makes these particular privileges troubling is that they were never revoked. When the Templars fell, most of their known legal advantages were rescinded, sometimes with venom. Yet these special exemptions are not mentioned again. They vanish quietly, as if their purpose ended the moment scrutiny began. One especially curious document discovered in the archives of the Abbey of Cluny describes a certain minister of the fold who was granted access to Templar and Hospitaller archives alike. No such title exists in any chivalric or ecclesiastical register. The abbey's own monks noted the oddity in the margins. He claimed no order wore no colors, but bore the seal of 3 tongues. Again, the Trinity motif, 3 symbols arranged in a triangle. And again, no further trace of the man himself. Some scholars argue these were diplomatic agents, liaisons between the church and the military orders, or early precursors to Vatican intelligence couriers. But those roles were usually formalized, and those men named. Not here, not once. And the pattern repeats in multiple languages across multiple regions over decades. Then there's the financial exemption granted in 1271 by Pope Gregory XI. The record shows that certain unnamed individuals were permitted to transfer Templar funds across borders without declaration or tithe. At a time when the Church was desperate to assert financial control, such permission was rare. And again, no identities are given. The decree simply says, "Those who walk the circle." That phrase surfaces once more in a marginal note scribbled into the corner of a Templar inventory in Sicily. For the circle's hand do not seal. You begin to wonder, were these exemptions legal fiction cover stories? Or did they reflect an actual hidden authority structure embedded deep within both the order and its relationship to Rome? A debated passage in the writings of Bernard of Clairvaux may offer a faint clue. In a lesser-known sermon, he speaks not only of soldiers of Christ, but of those who carry the flame unseen, neither vowing nor departing. While the mainstream interpretation casts this as spiritual metaphor, a minority of scholars believe it's something else, a quiet nod to those who served without joining, who commanded without conquering. One Templar manual from the Iberian Peninsula, fragmentary, water-stained, and barely legible, includes a section titled De illis quos non dissimus. Of those we do not name, it is a list of tasks to be fulfilled but never attributed. Instructions to heed instructions without identifying the source. The chain of authority simply reads, as told, as always. And you remember now the letters, the marginal figures at the councils, the foreign guests who spoke but were not counted, the silence not as an absence, but as a credential. These exemptions, granted by the highest earthly authority in Christendom, were not afterthoughts. They were formal permissions for invisible roles. They allowed movement through legal walls. They allowed authority without scrutiny. They allowed the hidden commanders to exist not as rebels, but as sanctioned phantoms. It leaves you with a final unspoken question. If the Pope himself made room for these men, did he serve them or simply fear them? It starts with a floor plan. Not a blueprint in the modern sense, but a diagram etched in charcoal on linen recovered from a collapsed manor in Gascony. At first glance, it looks like a standard Templar commandery. Square courtyard, inner chapel, dormitories, armory. But then your eye lingers on a corner chamber that isn't labeled. No purpose given. No access corridor. Just a sealed rectangle within the wall, perfectly aligned with the sunrise on the Feast of the Magdalene. That's the first sign that the architecture of the Templars might have carried more than functionality. That some designs served not just the order's physical needs, but the commands of a presence hidden even from the builders themselves. The official line is that Templar structures were practical, defensive, stark, and that's mostly true. Their commanderies, preceptories, and fortresses followed consistent patterns. Thick walls, narrow slits for arrows, central chapels positioned with east-facing altars. And yet, exceptions exist. Quiet ones. Persistent ones. In Syria, you find a keep where the southern wall forms a Fibonacci spiral centuries before that math was formalized in the West. In Spain, a chapel whose echo only completes when a man stands in a specific corner and whispers. In Normandy, a doorway that doesn't align with any room, its lintel carved with a symbol found nowhere else in Christian Europe, but nearly identical to an inscription on a Phoenician tomb. You wonder at first if these are just anomalies, creative flourishes, the whims of local masons. But the deeper you look, the more deliberate they seem. They show up in places that share no cultural influence, no common architects, no shared patrons. What they do share is the presence of Templar activity, often military, often secretive, and often undocumented. A chapel in Cyprus includes a side room sealed not by mortar, but by instruction. The door is perfectly functional, the mechanism intact. But a letter discovered beneath the floorboards explains that entry is not to be made until the return of the Veiled One. That letter is unsigned. And that room, its dimensions match an inner chamber diagram found in a completely different Templar site in Portugal. Down to the inch. Some scholars dismiss these overlaps as accidents of medieval standardization. A castle's a castle after all. But others point to the mathematical precision ratios that mirror ancient mystery schools, alignments with solstices, references to Pythagorean triangles. Some of these design choices require knowledge not found in any known Templar training or record. Knowledge in some cases that would have required instruction from outside Europe altogether. An especially compelling example lies in the design of the ruined preceptory at Tamar, Portugal. Most focus on the circular church modeled after the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. But beneath the nave, hidden behind a false pillar, is a spiral stairwell descending into a hexagonal chamber. No records indicate its use. The chamber is acoustically dead, so silent you hear your own heartbeat. And carved into its ceiling is the same tri-dot triangle seen in the sealed letters and exemption grants. The masons who built these structures rarely left names, but stonemasons did have marks, small symbols carved into blocks to track their work. In at least 3 known Templar sites, you find a variant that doesn't match any known guild, 3 straight lines, crossing at a central point, like a compass rose missing its circle. Always in hidden corners. Always near anomalous features. One theory suggests these builders weren't local, that they were part of a traveling group, perhaps not even formally Templar, who specialized in secretive commissions. A shadow guild trained to embed sacred geometry and hidden compartments into otherwise standard designs. Their purpose? Perhaps to prepare sanctuaries for meetings, initiations, or activities too delicate for official halls. Architectural historians have quietly debated the existence of such a guild for decades. Some call it fanciful. Others point to consistent deviations rooms with no windows, staircases that end at blank walls, tunnels that lead nowhere unless perhaps you know the code. A particularly striking clue comes from the commandery at Lyon in France. A visitor's account from 1296 describes a library door that only opens when a specific psalm is sung at midnight. The mechanism was lost, the room eventually sealed, but the account survives in a monk's journal. No Templar ever recorded such a room in Lyon. And yet the monastery that now stands on the site has foundation stones bearing the same triangular seal, weathered, but still visible. You return to the idea of a hidden command structure. These weren't just men who acted invisibly. They built invisibly. Their spaces reflected the same silence as their names. And it may be that these architectural flourishes were not symbols of ego, but signatures of obedience to a set of instructions, given orally, passed quietly, followed precisely. Not everyone saw the hidden doorways. Not every knight noticed the angled sunbeam that marked an unseen passage. But someone did. Someone always did. And if they weren't listed as builders, if they weren't named in plans, it was likely because they answered to a rule that couldn't be written. So the next time you walk through a stone corridor in an old fortress, run your fingers along the wall. Feel for the irregular edge, count the stones above the lintel, and listen very carefully to the silence. Because in some rooms, it's not just empty, it's encoded. You trace a path through Europe with your fingertip over old parchment, brittle and yellowed at the edges. It's a map drawn in 1305, just 2 years before the arrests began. Each dot marks a Templar commandery. Many are familiar: Paris, La Rochelle, Tomar, Limassol. But then your eye catches something odd. 3 dots in Bohemia, 2 in the Western Pyrenees, 1 a tiny red mark nestled deep in the Carpathians. None of them appear in the ledgers. None are mentioned in the Grand Master's rolls. And none, according to Templar law, should exist. That's where the mystery deepens. Because while the Templars were masters of record-keeping, their infrastructure was designed for visibility to kings, to the Pope, to their own bureaucracy. But outside that network, there were places with no signatures, no charters, no official founding date. And yet, they were unmistakably Templar in style. Square courtyards, Latin inscriptions, chapels aligned to sunrise, and symbols carved into lintels, familiar ones, and others far less so. In the Basque region, shepherds tell of a ruined stone building buried beneath moss and vines. Locals call it La Casa Silenciosa, silent house. No one lives there now, but inside are faded paintings of knights on horseback, stars carved into the beams, and a spiral staircase that leads nowhere. No local church ever claimed it. No aristocratic family registered it. Yet oral tradition insists that centuries ago, strange foreign monks lived there who rode out at night and never once asked for coin. A similar site exists in southern Poland, nestled near the Tatra foothills. A cellar complex under a collapsed church bears all the architectural signatures of Templar construction. Right angles, hidden nooks, and the same symbol you've seen before, 3 dots in a triangle this time, painted faintly in soot across a stone altar. No name, no records, but clear signs of occupation. What binds these places together is not what they contain, but what they lack: documentation. Even rogue monastic orders left trails, conflicts with local bishops, donations logged by grateful nobles. But these safe houses are shadows. They show up in oral histories, in half-burned tax ledgers, in letters from frightened merchants who describe riders with no insignia demanding silence in exchange for gold. The most curious example lies in eastern Germany, near an old pagan site. In a valley the locals call Das Stille Tal, the quiet vale, lies a collapsed manor. Archaeologists investigating the foundations uncovered Templar-era coins, chainmail fragments, and a library carved into the earth, its entrance concealed beneath a collapsed hearth. The books inside not liturgical texts, but encrypted ledgers. Financial records encoded with a cipher resembling Hebrew letters, rearranged through Greek numerology. The only recognizable Latin phrase in the entire collection reads "property of the fifth door." No known Templar council, chapter, or mission ever bore that name. So what were these places? Some argue they were supply caches, emergency storehouses meant to support fleeing knights in times of crisis. Others claim they were black sites used for punishment or secret initiation rituals. But a third, quieter theory has begun to spread among fringe scholars that these safe houses were the operational bases of the hidden commanders. Not outposts in the conventional sense, but listening posts, relay stations, sanctuaries for men who didn't exist, at least not on paper. A letter found in an abbey in Soria supports this idea. It describes a knight arriving on horseback, wounded but proud, refusing sanctuary from the monks because his road led not to Rome, but to the hollow cross. The monks assumed it was a metaphor, but when the letter was rediscovered centuries later, that phrase, hollow cross, matched a carving found on a stone slab buried deep beneath a ruin in the Dordogne. A ruin that again bore no charter, no signature, but all the fingerprints of the order. There's also the troubling case of the English manor in Northumberland, where a wine cellar was sealed and forgotten for centuries. When it was reopened, researchers found barrels of salt-preserved meat, a rack of swords, and a wall of scrolls, none of them bearing dates, names, or insignia. Just a recurring phrase burned into the beam overhead, veritas in umbris. Truth in shadows. The implications are staggering. If the Templars maintained a separate infrastructure of unlisted properties, hidden from church crown and even their own brothers, then who directed them, who allocated funds, who decided what was built, where, and why? And then, of course, there's the strange continuity. Several of these hidden locations remained in use long after the order fell. Witness accounts describe robed men arriving at midnight speaking languages unrecognized by locals, leaving behind gold coins and empty candle stubs. At least one location near the Hungarian border was reportedly guarded by mercenaries as late as the 17th century. You think again of the idea of a separate chain of command. It would have needed supply lines, secure meeting places, and discreet shelters, places with no witnesses and no paperwork. These safe houses were not ruins. They were whispers made of stone. A network invisible to the chroniclers, but very visible to the men who needed it. The hidden commanders may have never worn the mantle, but they clearly moved through the dark with certainty, never unsure of where to turn or where to hide. Because unlike the knights who marched beneath banners, these men built their sanctuary into the folds of silence. You've heard the story often enough that within the Templar order, the Grand Master's word was final. That he was the center of command, the tip of the sword, the anchor of loyalty. And in many ways, this was true formally. But every now and then, the narrative bends. A decision is reversed. A directive is quietly set aside. And the explanation, when it surfaces at all, is unsettling. The Grand Master was informed of a higher will. One such moment occurs in 1243. A dispute erupts in Provence over the transfer of lands held jointly with the Cistercians. The Grand Master at the time, Guillaume de Sonnac, issues a formal decision the order will retain the property, citing historical right and military necessity. But the next document in the archive, a curt missive from a commander in Toulouse, announces the reversal. The lands are to be surrendered. No explanation. No counter-order from Guillaume. Just a line, "The circle has spoken." That phrase again. The circle. A term that reappears in whispers on stone beams and scarred parchments, but never in official charters. And here, for the first time, it supersedes the highest authority in the order. A fragment from a Venetian account adds more weight. It references a gathering in which the Grand Master, unnamed, but context suggests de Sonnac was persuaded to alter his course regarding a fleet's movement. Not by his council nor by his advisors, but by a single rider who arrived unaccompanied and left the same night. The chronicler notes the man wore the order's cross reversed and whispered like a priest at confession. Then there's the curious case of a failed siege in Anatolia. The Templars had prepared for weeks. Troops were assembled, routes planned. But days before the departure, the mission was cancelled. The only surviving explanation appears in a hastily written memorandum from a marshal in Rhodes. The balance shifted. The flame retracted. We wait. Not even the Grand Master's voice is recorded here, as if his decision had been overridden before he could speak. This pattern of reversals and quiet silences starts to form a shadow behind the visible hierarchy. You find meeting minutes where the Grand Master is present but strangely passive. Other commanders speak, plans unfold, but he withholds judgment as if awaiting a voice not present in the room or not heard by most. Historians have struggled with these anomalies. Some attribute them to internal politics, factionalism, or external pressure from Rome. But those explanations fall short when the reversals concern not doctrine or diplomacy, but logistics, troop movements, land disputes, and local governance. These are not theological arguments. They are operational shifts executed cleanly, efficiently, and without trace. In one preserved letter from an Aragonese commander, the writer expresses frustration. "Our master approves, yet still we pause. They await the second ink." The dry seal has not dropped. The phrase "second ink" appears again in a Cypriot codex, where it refers to an unseen authority needed to complete the will. Scholars have speculated that this might refer to a financial backer or a papal legate. But the consistency of the terminology and its placement in contexts far from Rome or commerce suggests something stranger. You think again of the architectural anomalies, the safe houses, the letters with no names. They describe an infrastructure that doesn't require visibility to exert power. Perhaps the Grand Master was not a sovereign, but a steward, one who ruled publicly while deferring privately to those whose authority was more ancient, more sacred, or simply more hidden. In 1289, a curious event unfolds in Marseille. A Grand Master preparing to dismiss a senior commander for disobedience suddenly changes his mind. No one knows why, but a monk's journal from the nearby monastery notes the arrival of a man in gray linen, marked only by silence, who entered the Templar quarters late one night and left before dawn. The monk writes, "He bowed to no one, and yet they listened." This isn't how authority normally works. Unless, of course, it was never about normalcy. Perhaps the Grand Masters were trained to recognize when their authority was merely the visible hand of something greater, something that didn't write memos but left imprints all the same. There is one final piece, a charter from Paris, 1291. It is unsigned, unfinished, possibly never sent. It reads, "In times of clarity I command. In times of fog I observe. But when the circle speaks, I remember what I am. The handwriting matches Jacques de Molay's, and that sentence, so plain, so resigned, says more than any edict or decree. It suggests a leader who understood the limits of his own power, who ruled with ink and seal, but waited always for the voice that spoke without needing either. So you ask, was the Grand Master the highest authority, or simply the most visible one? They stood at the fringes of the chapel, often silent, never kneeling. They wore no mantle, carried no blade, took no vows of chastity or poverty. And yet, when they entered a Templar commandery, knights stepped aside. Not with reverence exactly, but with recognition. Like men acknowledging a superior officer who does not wear the uniform. The Templar order, in all its public documentation, was built upon strict monastic ideals. Entry required vows. Uniforms were standardized. Hierarchy was inflexible. Knights, sergeants, squires, each role carefully demarcated. But scattered across Inquisition records and overlooked correspondence are references to figures who operated entirely outside this framework. Men who held authority within the order and yet were never formally part of it. A transcript from the Aragonese proceedings in 1310 contains a strange exchange. A knight under questioning is asked whether he obeyed only the Grand Master. He hesitates, then replies, "We obeyed those who came from the house in silence." The inquisitor presses for clarification. The knight simply says, "They were not of us, but we were theirs." That's not theology. That's hierarchy. There's also a surviving will from a Templar quartermaster in Leon. In it, he bequeaths a portion of his savings not to the church, not to his order, not to family, but to a man named Ferran, described as our faithful companion of the fold. No order is named, no monastic title, and Ferran never appears in any initiation record. This phrase, companion of the fold, emerges again in an obscure French letter preserved in the archives of Clermont. It describes a visit from one of the fold, who asked no blessing but carried the flame. The author notes that the man dressed like a merchant carried no weapon and yet presided over the chapter meeting as though born to the marble seat. Some have speculated that these were wealthy patrons, nobles who funded the order in exchange for informal influence. But the pattern suggests more than financial support. These men issued orders. They corrected strategies. In some cases, they even reallocated resources without approval from any known Templar authority. In a ledger from the Poitou region, a simple line stands out amid entries for grain and horses' reserves redirected per LG instruction. There are no initials LG in the commandery's records, no corresponding seal, and yet the action was carried out without hesitation. That same pair of initials, LG, appears years later in a letter from a Templar outpost near Bruges. The context is different, the handwriting entirely unrelated, yet the phrasing is identical, LG has confirmed. Begin Phase 2. Who was LG? A merchant, a landowner. A relic from a secret tradition passed mouth to mouth. Then there's the case of the Marseille enclave, where a local magistrate records that a man of noble bearing, dressed plainly but attended by 4 knights, arrived unannounced and was given full access to the Templar treasury vault. The knights accompanying him were real, confirmed by their own letters. Yet the man himself remains unnamed, unrecorded, unclassified. It is as though he existed entirely in the margins, written only in the reactions of others. One theory, often ridiculed, but never quite disproven, suggests that these figures were part of a parallel initiation, a non-monastic caste within the Templar world. Men not bound by the same vows, but deeply entangled in its aims. Perhaps they were aristocratic bloodlines entrusted with stewardship. Perhaps they were members of older traditions, esoteric, administrative, or financial, whose loyalties ran alongside but outside of the Templar structure. A Templar guidebook found in a Scottish priory includes a diagram labeled Domus Duplex, the double house. It's crudely drawn, but suggests two parallel structures, one visible bearing the known ranks, the other faded but insistent, connected only by broken lines and question marks. Beside it, a Latin scrawl reads, "The brothers fight, the others guide." There is also the matter of the sealed invitations. Several commanderies kept tightly controlled guest books as required by papal statute. Most are what you'd expect, pilgrims, envoys, inspectors. But every now and then, a guest is listed only as ad voluntatem domini, at the Lord's will. One guest recorded in London in 1283 was listed simply as AG traveling under no house. Yet the visit triggered a full reshuffle of leadership the following month. You recall the safe houses, the sealed rooms, the encoded letters. They all point to a structure that depended on discretion, not declaration. And these non-monastic figures who never took vows, never wore white, and yet moved freely among those who did, may have been its architects. Their power was quiet, their presence undocumented, and yet they pulled levers that even the Grand Masters deferred to. Perhaps they were the memory keepers, the financiers, the archivists of an older knowledge. Or perhaps they were simply there to ensure that the order never strayed from a deeper, unspoken path. Either way, they were not anomalies. They were features, shadows built into the walls. Not brothers, not knights, but something else. The ones who never needed to kneel because they had already been obeyed. War was the Templars' currency. Their reputation was forged not in councils or cloisters, but in sieges, ambushes, and brutal stands against overwhelming odds. So it's strange, almost absurd, that some of their military operations left behind no chronicle, no date, no names. And yet they happened. The evidence is scattered like boot prints washed by time, but there if you know where to look. And when you start to connect these traces, a disturbing possibility emerges that the hidden commanders didn't just whisper behind the throne. They waged war of their own. In 1272, a series of well-coordinated raids struck several Saracen supply routes in northern Syria. Muslim chronicles describe mounted knights bearing no heraldry, striking with Templar precision. Survivors assumed they were rogue elements from Tripoli. Yet the Templar records from that region show no deployments, no losses, no recognition of engagement. When a captured knight was interrogated, he gave no name, just a phrase, "This flame leaves no ash." You encounter something similar in the Languedoc. In a remote village near Albi, stone ruins remain of what locals call La Chapelle de l'Oubli, the Chapel of Forgetting. Beneath it, archaeologists found weapons stamped with the cross patty. Not unusual, except the metal bore no regional identifiers, and the construction style suggests they were forged for speed, not ceremony. Oral tradition holds that Grey Knights arrived one autumn, drove out a rogue noble faction, and vanished before winter's first snow. The Templar houses nearby at Narbonne and Toulouse make no mention of this intervention. The local bishop's records simply state order restored. No formal actors present. Even more unsettling is the campaign near the Black Sea, where Byzantine reports describe Templar-style cavalry assisting in a border conflict between two rival Bulgarian factions. No treaty had been signed, no authorization given. The writers, when asked who they served, reportedly replied, "The one who does not kneel." That phrase reappears in a Cypriot ledger from years later, scribbled in the margin beside a supply list of salted meat and arrows reserved for those who do not kneel. You begin to notice the traits of these silent campaigns. They were small, surgical, often occurring in territories where the order had no official holdings. They required intelligence coordination and material support impossible without the consent of high-ranking officials. Yet none of the known leadership ever claimed them. They remained ghosts. Some historians have dismissed these anomalies as fabrications, folk tales twisted over time, or mercenary groups adopting Templar aesthetics. But these explanations don't hold when confronted with physical evidence. Recovered armor plates identical to standard Templar issue but stripped of sigils. Maps marked with geometric patterns not seen in military documentation, but matching designs carved into the hidden rooms of certain Templar strongholds. One recovered parchment in Iberia shows a triangle divided into 3 arcs, each labeled not with regions, but with Latin words: obedientia, silentium, praeventio, obedience, silence, preemption. Then there's the matter of funds. A set of banking records from the Temple in London shows a curious withdrawal enough to finance a campaign dispersed not to any regional commander, but to a courier identified only as SR. A week later, reports emerge of a skirmish on the Welsh border quashed before the Crown even heard of it. No arrests, no documentation. Just silence and one burned farmhouse with a sword rammed through the hearthstone. The most compelling piece, though, is a letter written by a former knight who had renounced the order but kept copies of certain records. He describes a faction within the Templars, unnamed, unsworn, who intervened when others hesitated. He writes, "They fought in silence for those whose names do not pass the lips of brothers." The letter ends abruptly, its final line obscured by ink blotting. But the shape of the last word is unmistakable: vigils, the watchers. Could it be that this unnamed force operated with the blessing, perhaps even under the command, of the hidden elite? If the known Templar hierarchy represented the armored hand, perhaps this was the unseen blade, acting without ceremony, without record, without accountability. The Grand Master may have given orders to armies, but the men behind the curtain, the silent commanders, may have guided entirely different forces, smaller, swifter, trained not to protect pilgrims or defend strongholds, but to shape outcomes. Quietly, surgically. And perhaps that's why these operations were never recorded. Not because they were shameful, but because they were never meant to be remembered by anyone outside the circle. They weren't failed campaigns. They were successful ones, achieving their aims and vanishing like a ripple on a dark lake. Because if war was the Templars' business, these men were not the generals. They were the scalpel in the dark. Step far enough outside the Latin world, and the story of the Templars starts to shift. In the courts of Baghdad, in the mountain fortresses of the Nizari assassins, and even in Mongol encampments stretching toward the Oxus, there are echoes, strange, quiet echoes of men who moved like Templars but didn't follow their rules. They negotiated with emirs without papal approval. They visited libraries closed to Christians. They knew words in Persian and Mongolian, and sometimes wore rings bearing no cross at all. Start with the assassins. The Nizari Ismailis, as they called themselves, were an order both feared and admired by the West. Their tactics, strategic infiltration, silent execution, absolute loyalty, drew gasps from European chroniclers. Yet beneath the propaganda lies a strange curiosity. Templars and assassins were at times unofficial allies. They traded, corresponded, even visited one another's strongholds. That much is documented. But one particular account, preserved in a Persian manuscript, describes a recurring visitor from the Brotherhood in red and white, who asked not for gold nor truce, but for names. This man, unnamed, reportedly sought knowledge records of ancient cities, diagrams of star positions, and details about sacred geometry. The assassins called him the one who carries the circle. The term appears again in a record from Alamut, where the librarian notes a foreign guest who spoke with the elder in private and left carrying no scrolls, but remembering everything. The Templars made no mention of this envoy, but the assassins did, and they remembered. Then there are the Mongols. During the late 13th century, while the Franks debated whether to align with or resist the horsemen of the East, a quiet exchange took place. Some knights, it seems, traveled beyond the accepted frontier. One letter recovered in Armenia, half-burned, written in Latin, mentions our brothers beyond the Caspian and references an oath spoken beneath twin moons. That could be metaphor, or it could refer to the astrological alignment that occurred in 1279, visible only from Central Asia. The Templar leadership in Cyprus denied any formal contact, but a Mongol dispatch preserved in Karakorum records a silent envoy from the west who wore no name and asked for no title but spoke of stones that bleed and towers that sing. The descriptions verge on the mystical, but the Mongols took the visit seriously. Enough to gift the man a cloak of white wolf fur, something reserved for honored guests, not madmen. Further east, still in a monastery near Samarkand, lies a wall fresco that defies explanation. It depicts 3 armored figures in a style unmistakably Western. Their mantles bear no insignia, yet they carry scrolls, not swords. One holds a golden compass, another a lantern. The third is pointing skyward at a constellation shaped like a triangle. Beneath them, a line in Syriac reads, "They came before the storm. They asked only to listen, and listen they did." These encounters, though scattered and largely unverified by Western sources, suggest a different picture of the Templar elite. Not merely warriors or monks, but seekers. Men entrusted with knowledge that extended beyond Europe, beyond Rome, beyond Christianity itself. Men who spoke in coded phrases, valued silence over sermon, and carried more questions than creeds. In one of the few Arabic sources to mention the Templars with anything resembling neutrality, the chronicler Ibn al-Athir writes of a knight who wore the garb of a pilgrim, but whose questions were those of a scholar. He notes that this man visited libraries in Damascus, consulted astronomers, and paid handsomely for information about ancient rivers no longer on maps. He was never named, never recorded again, but his trail, like so many others, leads into shadows. Some historians have dismissed these accounts as fantasy or worse, as projection Eastern chroniclers romanticizing Western visitors. But when these fragments begin to echo one another across languages and centuries, a pattern emerges. A soft rhythm under the noise of crusade and conquest. A rhythm that suggests a select few within the Templars moved according to a different map, one that included lands never conquered and voices never silenced. It also explains in part why certain decisions made by the order seem out of sync with church policy. Why they refused to condemn the assassins outright. Why they negotiated with powers Rome feared. Why they preserved routes and texts deemed heretical. Perhaps it wasn't defiance. Perhaps it was obedience to a broader mandate. And this brings you back to the hidden commanders. Men who didn't merely hide within Europe but blurred the lines between continents. Who saw East and West not as opposites but as mirrors. Who understood that control wasn't always about force, but about what you knew and where you listened. In a ruined priory near Edessa, a shattered floor tile bears a symbol rarely seen in the West, a spiral surrounding a single dot. An Eastern motif, yes, but one you've now seen etched in the margins of Templar documents, scrawled in cipher painted into chapel ceilings. It may not prove anything. But then again, symbols like that weren't meant to prove. They were meant to be recognized by those who already knew. The fall of Acre in 1291 is supposed to mark the end of an era, the final gasp of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land, the curtain closing on 100 years of war faith and ruin. It's a well-documented catastrophe. Fires in the harbor, knights drowning in their own armor, priests torn from altars. And yet, for all the lists of casualties, all the rosters of survivors, there's something odd, something missing. Certain names vanish completely, not in the usual way, lost in battle, swallowed by sea, or forgotten in chaos. No. These names were erased. They didn't appear on post-siege prisoner registers. They weren't cited in inquisitorial transcripts years later. They weren't mourned in monastic records or referenced in letters to Rome. It's as if they dissolved. Start with Brother Odin of Tyre. He was known to have commanded a garrison near the city wall. Brave, charismatic, unofficially referred to as the Lantern by his peers for the way his orders always arrived before the enemy. After Acre fell nothing. His name isn't on the lists of the dead. No relatives filed claims. No assets were logged. A chronicler from Pisa who had once met Odin wrote simply, "He did not fall. He did not leave. He was unmade." Another case, Brother Mathieu of Jaffa, a trusted quartermaster with years of financial records tied to his name. He oversaw a critical supply line during the final siege. Yet his name disappears from the ledgers between April and June. Not even a scribbled note, no assumed dead, no replacement recorded. But in a dusty ledger in Cyprus, someone penciled in a single phrase beside a blank line, "Taken by the fold." The handwriting doesn't match any scribe from that house. Scholars have tried to explain these disappearances with logistics. The fall of Acre was chaotic, they say. Documents lost, ink-smeared bodies misidentified. And that's true. But not for everyone. Because while hundreds of names appear with causes of death, burial sites, or accounts from fellow survivors, a small handful are not just absent, they are surgically removed. Crossed out in some cases. Burned away in others. One Genoese scribe referred to it as the quiet scouring. A papal investigator reviewing the order's collapse noted an unusually high number of null returns from certain Templar houses. Entire sets of records were missing, but only for a particular window of time, and often only for 1 or 2 men per site. It was as if someone had walked through the smoke and flames with a list checking off those who needed to vanish before the ash settled. And then there are the coded letters messages sent weeks after the fall to Templar outposts in Portugal and Aragon. One reads, "The shadow survived, flame retained. Host to the 4th remains. No sender, no signature." The cipher used is the same found in an earlier communication regarding safe house supply inventories, the kind you've already seen in connection with the hidden commanders. It leads to a compelling, if deeply uncomfortable question. What if some Templars were never meant to be accounted for? What if their roles were too secret to allow for posthumous recognition? Or worse, what if they didn't die at Acre at all? One account from a fleeing merchant describes a strange scene on the night before the city fell. He writes of a small group of knights leaving through a north gate, not with the wounded, not with the refugees, but alone. No standards, no escort, just silence. They rode in the dark, he writes, as if going towards something, not away. There are rumors, plenty of them, that a ship left Acre during the final siege. Not the known Templar vessels that sailed to Cyprus, a different one. Unregistered, smaller. Said to be loaded not with relics or gold, but people. People who didn't wear the mantle but gave orders just the same. It's impossible to prove. But one shipping log from a private dock in Sidon, dated 2 days after Acre's fall, notes the arrival of 6 men of no declared house. They paid in silver, carried no cargo, and requested no lodging. The clerk who wrote this note added a final line, almost an afterthought. They smelled of smoke, and one wept without tears. Not long after, whispers spread among the surviving Templars in Cyprus, not of defeat, but of preparation. That a council not bound by parchment had already met. That some decisions had already been made. And this perhaps is the most haunting aspect of all. That while thousands perished in the chaos of Acre, while scrolls turned to ash and steel rusted in blood, the hidden commanders did not mourn. They mobilized. They withdrew their own, not out of fear, but out of design. Their disappearance wasn't a casualty of war. It was a continuation of something already in motion, a structure that could not afford to be exposed, even in collapse. It's easy to assume that the Vatican feared only heresy paganism or the creeping influence of rival kings. Those threats were visible, loud, easy to condemn from a pulpit or erase with a fire. But sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones you cannot publicly name, not because you don't know who they are, but because acknowledging them would mean admitting you are not in control. Within the corridors of Rome, among the sealed papal briefs and personal correspondences, there lies a subtle pattern of unease. Not open hostility toward the Templars, at least not at first, but something quieter. A nervousness, a hint that the Pope didn't always understand what the Templars were doing, and worse, couldn't stop them when he did. A private letter from Pope Clement IV to a French bishop reveals a crack in the polished facade. In it, the Pope complains of certain brethren who answer neither to rule nor to Rome but to that which has no name. He asks that reports be gathered quietly and that nothing be committed to official record until confirmation. The bishop's reply has been lost, or perhaps never arrived. But the Pope's fear is written clearly not of a rebellion, but of a ghost within the system. Later, under Pope Boniface VIII, we find repeated references to the East Gate, not a place, but a phrase. It surfaces in 3 documents related to papal inquiries into Templar finances. Each time it is framed as an obstacle. The East Gate resists audit. The East Gate answers with wind. It's unclear whether the term was metaphorical or code. But in each instance, the investigation ends prematurely, the tone one of frustration rather than resolution. Then there's the matter of a papal legate dispatched to investigate irregularities in Provence. The legate, a stern cleric named Niccolò, was expected to inspect a commandery suspected of hoarding unaccounted funds. He was never heard from again. His body was found months later in a ravine, boots missing, hands clasped in prayer. The official cause of death was misadventure. The Vatican quietly buried the file. But an internal note in the margins of an unrelated letter, scribbled in a different hand, reads, "He looked too long into the mirror." What was the mirror? That phrase too recurs in troubling places. In the trial records of Templar knights interrogated under torture, a few make cryptic references to servants of the mirror, or the ones who polished the eye. Inquisitors initially thought it was symbolic language for heresy. But a Dominican archivist who reviewed the transcripts decades later wrote a quiet warning in his journal. These words were not confession. They were deflection. Something else stood behind them. We often assume that the papal purge of the Templars was about power, wealth, jealousy, and certainly those were factors. But within the inner circles of the Curia, there is evidence of something deeper, not anger, but confusion, and then fear. A bundle of letters from Pope Clement V, written just months before the infamous arrests of 1307, express a chilling awareness. One letter addressed to an unnamed cardinal opens with the line, "It is not the order that troubles me, but the ones it shelters." Another, never sent, reads, "If the circle has eyes, then so must we. But I do not know where to look." That line, the circle, has eyes resurfaces in a ciphered note recovered centuries later in the Vatican basement, tucked into the back of a Templar dossier. It was unsigned, but bore the triangular seal seen in previous chapters. The note simply said, "They have always watched, even before the temple, even before Peter." Now pause on that. Because if these men, the hidden commanders, operated outside the known structure of the order and yet within it, and if Rome knew they existed but could not name them, then what does that make them a shadow institution within a holy military machine? Or something older, something the papacy inherited but never truly controlled. We know from financial records that Templar funds often moved without clerical approval, that operations occurred with papal blessing, but not always with papal understanding, and in the wake of the order's collapse, some within the Curia admitted as much. One cardinal, in a rare moment of candor, is recorded as saying, "We dissolved the mantle, but not the flame. It still flickers where we dare not breathe." This fear was not about doctrine, it was about invisibility. About a structure that obeyed the Pope when convenient, but answered to something else entirely when it mattered. Something older, quieter, and infinitely more patient. And that's why Rome could never name the enemy. Because to do so would be to admit it existed, and to admit that the keys of Peter, however sacred, did not open every door. A cipher doesn't just conceal information. It reshapes, it turns meaning into mystery, clarity into puzzle. And in the case of the Knights Templar, some ciphers weren't simply used to protect secrets from outsiders. They were used to keep knowledge within a very specific inner circle, one small enough, trusted enough, or hidden enough to justify a language of its own. You begin with a manuscript recovered in Tamar, Portugal. It's a slim volume bound in dark leather tucked behind a false panel in the library's stone wall. Written in a mixture of Latin and what appears to be code, the document was once dismissed as a devotional. But upon closer inspection, you realize it's not prayers, it's policy. The phrases describe orders of operation, authority chains, access protocols, and thresholds for action. But none of it matches the known rule of the order. It speaks instead of second assent, unseen counsel, and passage by sound rather than seal. One chilling line reads, "He who commands in shadow must obey without voice." Another, beneath a diagram of intersecting lines and dots, states, "The first key is silence. The second is fire. The third does not exist." Similar coded language appears in a scorched codex found in Cyprus, hidden beneath the chapel floor of a ruined commandery. The text refers to Domus Interlata, the interlaid house, and outlines procedures for decision-making during times of fragmentation. It lists no names, only symbols. A triangle, an open eye, and a crescent enclosed in a square. Each figure corresponds to a speaker of the fold, binder of the circle, and servant without place. None of these titles exist in the Templar hierarchy, at least not the one we're told about. Some scholars argue these are metaphorical, that the texts represent spiritual exercises or philosophical constructs. But then why encode them so completely? Why hide them in separate countries, separated by years, and written in the same rotated cipher? A transposition method not cracked until the 19th century. A hidden pattern begins to emerge. These documents were not defensive encryptions against Muslim adversaries or papal inquisitors. They were internal, meant only for those initiated into a deeper branch of the order. A branch that had its own laws. One document from a hidden archive beneath an abbey in Aragon provides further clarity. Written entirely in cipher, it begins with a stark proclamation: the circle is not governed, it governs. What follows is a list of 10 precepts, brief, poetic, and haunting. Among them, take no title, for title binds. Obey the flame, not the hand. All truth must cross 3 veils before it is spoken. The one who speaks first is not the one who knows. The rhythm feels liturgical, almost like commandments. But there's no mention of Christ, no references to Jerusalem, and no appeal to Scripture. These are laws of control, discretion, and selective obedience. This is a code for governance by invisibility. Even more telling is the marginalia surrounding the texts. In one instance, a later hand, likely a monk unfamiliar with the cipher, scribbled a single phrase in plain Latin: "This is not the rule. This is the mechanism." Think about that for a moment. If the visible rule was the doctrine, this was the machinery beneath it. The engine that ran quietly without banner or trumpet. You don't get the sense of heresy from these documents. You don't feel defiance. What you feel is design, purpose, cold, unshakable control. In a private letter discovered among the Vatican's unofficial archives, a cardinal expresses concern over a group within the Templars who obey laws we have never read in voices we have never heard. He was not worried about sin. He was worried about access. They close doors before we find them, he wrote. They prepare answers for questions not yet asked. Some of the ciphered texts even include contingency plans. One describes how to move relics across hostile terrain without alerting church or crown. Another outlines how to communicate across sea routes using encoded lantern signals, a system that modern analysts have verified as plausible, even sophisticated. And then there's the symbol, the triangle of dots. It appears in margin seals and between lines like a silent punctuation mark. Once in the ciphered commandments, it's referenced directly: mark thrice for what is seen. Mark once for what is known. It isn't a flourish, it's an instruction. You return now to everything that came before: the erased names, the silent councils, the rooms built into empty stone, the men without vows giving orders to those who had sworn their lives away. It all aligns. Not just because of belief, but because of this, they were following a different set of laws. A legal system built not on papal approval, but on unspoken oaths encoded in ink few could read. One final discovery seals the theory. In a crumbling monastery near Lyon, hidden within the spine of a defaced psalter, is a single strip of parchment. On it, 4 symbols inked in iron black. 3 are known: the triangle, the eye, the crescent square. The 4th is less familiar, a circle broken at the top. Beneath it, a line of text in cipher decoded only recently. When the temple falls, these shall remain. And they did. Not because history remembered them, but because they remembered themselves. After the arrests, the trials, the tortures, and the fires, it should have ended. The temple was dissolved by papal decree in 1312. Lands were seized, archives, scattered reputations burned alongside flesh. Yet in certain corners of Europe, whispers continued. Not of survival in the grand cinematic sense, no banners raised, no armies regrouped, but of something quieter, a persistence, a thread that slipped through the teeth of the trap, the line that didn't break. You begin in Scotland, where the order was never formally condemned. The papal bull arrived, yes, but Robert the Bruce, excommunicated himself at the time, saw no need to enforce it. Templar properties were quietly absorbed, their residents renamed but not removed. One estate in particular in the highlands near Ballantor maintained the same stewards for decades, men who bore no mantle but kept to a strict calendar, held closed-door meetings at solstice, and buried their dead with stones carved in triangular patterns. Locals called them the white men who wear black at night. Then there's the curious case of Aragon, where several former Templar knights were granted amnesty in exchange for quiet service to the crown. Some became tax collectors, others advisors. But a few faded from all records entirely, only to reappear as signatories on obscure legal contracts decades later, using aliases traced to no family and bearing symbols matching those seen in ciphered commandments. In one such contract, dated 1348, the witness signs not with a name, but with a Mark III intersecting lines flanked by a crescent and a dot. The same emblem carved above the sealed room beneath Tomar. A recurring phrase begins to surface across scattered legal and architectural documents: Domus Silenti, the House of Silence. It appears in land transfers, in the renovation plans of churches, and in the margin notes of local officials who could never quite explain where certain tenants came from. In Toulouse, a magistrate complains of men who obey no known order but answer to a code older than Rome's. That line was preserved only because the magistrate died suddenly and his clerk filed the note by mistake. What's striking is the uniformity. Across regions, these shadows moved with similar methods: discrete ownership of rural land, minimal visibility, and an unusual focus on preserving subterranean structures, cellars, crypts, passages beneath chapels. One could argue these were merely survival tactics, but the precision suggests something more structured, more guided. In the Orkney Islands, oral tradition holds that a man in white arrived by boat after the Great Fires in France, carrying a single book wrapped in oilskin and a ring carved from antler. He lived alone, spoke rarely, but once a year he met with 3 others who arrived separately and left the same night. His descendants still living there keep the ring in a drawer and refer to him only as the last one who knew the door. Meanwhile, in Portugal, records show a transformation that is often presented as administrative convenience. The Templar properties were transferred to a new organization, the Order of Christ. But the leadership didn't change. The buildings didn't change. Even some of the rules didn't change. The only thing that disappeared was the name. Except, not quite. Hidden in the correspondence of the early Order of Christ is a symbol that should not be there. On a shipping manifest from 1326, next to a list of provisions bound for a fortress near Tomar, is the triangle of dots, again tiny in the corner but unmistakable. The code survived. The flame didn't flicker. It simply moved deeper underground. There's even a letter from 1331 in which the Grand Prior of the Order of Christ addresses a brother from the fold. This term, long absent from public record since the Purge, resurfaces without explanation. The tone is deferential. He writes, "We await further guidance before consecrating the inner chamber." What inner chamber? The document gives no location. But 3 months later, renovation records from a chapel in Sintra note a crew being paid triple their usual wage to work without question or map for 2 nights. No description of the work was recorded. The chapel still stands. No one has found the room. Scholars have argued for centuries that Templar survival in the post-1312 world was symbolic at best. But symbols are stubborn, and certain rituals don't fade, they migrate. One particularly odd example is a guild in Belgium, originally formed as a wine merchants' fraternity, which insisted its elders be selected in silence under a moonless sky, with hands placed on a stone shaped like an eye. They still do it that way today. Ask them why, and they'll say it's tradition. Ask them who started it, and they'll go very quiet. Not all lines are loud. Some stretch, fade, and reappear where you least expect them. In cemeteries with unmarked graves, in doorways that align with distant stars, in old houses where one room always stays locked. The Templar order may have collapsed, But something within it, something quieter, older, and deeper remained. Not in books, not in law, but in a code carried forward by those who never needed their name on a scroll to know who they were. They called themselves brothers once. Now they are watchers. Now they are memory. Now they are silence that remembers. At first glance, the trials of the Templars seem like the end of the story. The long, slow exhale after the tension of centuries. Accusations of blasphemy, confessions under torture, public burnings in front of cathedrals. The order brought low not by sword or siege, but by parchment and fear. But the more you study the transcripts, the more you notice something peculiar. The questions asked are strangely narrow, the answers oddly rehearsed, and the men who truly mattered, the ones who shaped the order's fate from the shadows, are never even mentioned. Take the Paris interrogations of 1307. Dozens of knights were questioned in rotating shifts, pressed to reveal heresies, secret rites, and hidden idols. Yet the inquisitors never once ask about unlisted safe houses, or financial irregularities, or unnamed visitors at chapter meetings. The investigation was aimed at ritual, not command, belief, not structure. It's as if the church wanted spectacle, not understanding, a purification, not a reckoning. Even the Grand Master Jacques de Molay confessed under duress, but his statements danced around operational details. He acknowledged ceremonies denied heresy and finally recanted altogether. But through it all, not one word about the alternate hierarchy. Not one phrase that hinted at the second circle. Not one question that asked who else was giving orders. One Templar named Raoul testified in Rouen that there were voices beyond the rule, but the scribe struck the line through. When questioned later, Raoul refused to elaborate, claiming the phrase was metaphor. The inquisitors didn't press. In fact, they seemed uninterested in anything that didn't fit the template. It's almost comical. You have an entire order suspected of harboring secrets, and no one asks if there were leaders not on the roster. Unless, of course, the point of the trial wasn't discovery, but decoy. Evidence suggests the trials may have been designed not to expose the truth, but to distract from it. By focusing on strange rituals and inflammatory accusations, the proceedings gave the church an easy enemy, one that could be publicly punished. The real structure, the hidden network that operated without names or seals, was left untouched, protected perhaps by the very spectacle intended to destroy the order. Consider the strange timing of the arrests. The warrants were issued in secrecy and executed simultaneously across France. Yet several key members, especially those tied to financial operations, simply vanished. No records of their arrest, no mention in the trials, and no indication they were ever pursued. In one royal report, a footnote remarks, certain individuals were not present and have not been located. Proceeding regardless. No follow-up, no concern. There's also the matter of the records themselves. A curious number of testimonies include redactions, not just names, but entire passages blacked out or cut from the record. Some of these excisions have been traced to orders from within the papal curia citing irrelevant material. But what was so irrelevant that it required erasure? In one surviving fragment from the Limoges hearings, a knight begins to describe those who met without mantle. The sentence is cut mid-syllable. The margin note reads only "not for trial." A few centuries later, when the Vatican revisited these files during internal reviews, a cardinal wrote a memo noting an unsettling consistency in the omissions. He didn't publish his findings, but he kept a private notebook in which he scrawled a question over and over: who wasn't on trial? The answer, it seems, is the hidden commanders. The men who operated through silence and cipher. They didn't sit in the front pews. They didn't lead charges into Jerusalem. They pulled strings, moved funds, opened sealed doors, and when the order was dismantled, they were already gone. One final piece confirms the suspicion. A letter discovered in a private archive in Avignon dated 2 weeks before the mass arrests references the extinguishing of the visible flame and instructs the recipient to leave your role but not your post. It's signed only with a symbol 3 overlapping circles distinct from the triangle seen elsewhere, but unmistakably similar in tone. The implication is chilling. The trials weren't a death blow. They were a reset. You begin to see it now. The public destruction of the Templars was never about revealing truth. It was about drawing attention away from it. A sleight of hand. A mask dropped while the real actors slipped out the back. Because you can only prosecute what you can name, and the ones who gave the quietest orders never left fingerprints. Templar wealth has always been a source of fascination and suspicion. Gold rumored to be hidden in secret vaults, treasure fleets that sailed into the mist, never seen again. The truth, as always, is more complicated and far more subtle. Because while the order did amass extraordinary riches, much of it didn't sit in chests behind iron gates. It moved, invisibly, silently, across borders, currencies, and kingdoms, managed not by those in armor, but by those whose names were never written down. The Templars are often credited with inventing the earliest forms of international banking. Pilgrims could deposit money in Paris and withdraw it in Jerusalem. Monarchs borrowed from them. Merchants trusted them. But buried within the ledgers and transaction scrolls, at least the ones that survived fire and purge, is a darker implication. Someone within the order had control over wealth that the visible command didn't fully grasp. Start with the transfer slips. In Bruges, a Templar house recorded a sudden movement of funds, nearly half its annual intake reallocated to a black register account. The slip bears no authorization from a Grand Master or regional commander. Instead, it's stamped with a symbol, a half-moon intersecting a triangle. No known Templar insignia matches it, but the same symbol appears in a set of financial records from Lisbon 2 years later, again connected to a large, undocumented movement of silver. In London, a cluster of unusual entries appears in the Temple's books between 1301 and 1304. Listed as gifts of trust, they represent vast sums routed through phantom recipients' names that appear nowhere else, with no accompanying titles or signatures. Some entries are followed by the phrase pro manus invisibilis, for the invisible hand. No one in the official hierarchy ever claimed authorship of these disbursements, yet the funds left the vaults. The money moved. One surviving audit from the Paris Temple rushed incomplete, but intact shows a column of outflows listed only by initials. All match nothing. Not a single set corresponds to any known Knight Master or functionary. At the bottom, the scribe has written a hesitant note. Receipts absent. Orders came from shadow. That word again. Shadow. It recurs in private merchant letters, in tax correspondence, and in at least one intercepted message from a Venetian broker who warns his client that the flame's shadow has no seal but controls more than Rome. It becomes clear that what the church and the crown saw, the tall towers, the armor, the ceremony, was only one part of the machine. Behind it, and far less visible, was a banking network routed not through papal bulls or royal grants, but through quiet men who never appeared at council. Men who operated in cipher and silence, who didn't just possess wealth, but moved it across a continent with no trace. Consider the complexity. This was a time when most nobles couldn't read, when currencies shifted from province to province, when border tolls made commerce slow and dangerous. Yet Templar funds flowed across this fractured terrain like water through hidden canals. In Aragon, a ledger notes the arrival of funds through the circle. In Hungary, a treasury receipt acknowledges a deposit in faith of the veil. These phrases are not poetic, they are procedural. One modern scholar suggested that the hidden commanders functioned as an inner banking elite, not simply keepers of wealth, but designers of its movement. They determined where funds were needed, where assets should be buried, when kings should be lent coin, and when they should not. If true, this means they weren't just financial officers, they were geopolitical tacticians. This theory is supported by a quietly ignored account from a Genoese merchant who met with Templars in a clandestine setting near Marseille. He describes not knights in armor, but men in gray cloaks seated around a circular table, each with a ledger and a different tongue. One spoke Greek, another Arabic. The third said little but marked the parchment with a 3-dot triangle each time a number was confirmed. The merchant called them bankers of the flame. He said they asked nothing of him, only listened. Of course, none of this appears in official doctrine. The rule of the temple says nothing about clandestine councils or decentralized financial networks. But then again, the rule also makes no mention of the ciphered laws or the safe houses or the unnamed guests. Silence is the signature. And nowhere is that signature more evident than in the way wealth moved without ever being seen. You're left with an image that isn't dramatic, but is perhaps even more powerful. Not a treasure hoard, not a map marked with red crosses, just ledgers, quiet, coded, incomplete, yet full of motion. Currency flowing like blood through unseen arteries, sustaining something no court ever summoned, no cardinal ever taxed. The Templars may have lost their name, but the ones who handled the gold never needed one. Their power wasn't in the vault, it was in the void. And when the order fell, that power didn't collapse. It simply rerouted. Not every journey taken by the Knights Templar involved a horse, a sword, or a map marked with distant cities. Some paths were walked entirely within, and for a select few, the most important initiation didn't occur on a battlefield or within the stone halls of a commandery, but inside a space that was invisible, unrecorded, and deeply personal. This was the inner pilgrimage, a concept almost entirely erased from official Templar history, and yet whispered in enough corners to suggest it once formed the heart of a different kind of order. It begins with a phrase found in a torn parchment buried in the foundations of a ruined Templar chapel in Provence. Written in flowing Latin, the line reads, "He who walks the outer path wears the cross. He who completes the inner bears none." The implications are startling. A distinction not just in rank, but in function, in loyalty, in purpose. Unlike the public initiations described in the rule-kneeling knights reciting oaths before the altar, the inner pilgrimage seems to have involved a far quieter transformation. There are no records of swords being tapped on shoulders. No formal ceremonies. Instead, the process is hinted at in marginalia metaphors and encoded sequences, a journey inward, marked by a shedding of symbols rather than an accumulation of them. A single page discovered in a Cypriot codex references the second door, which opens only after the veil is no longer needed. That page includes no further context, only a circular diagram divided into 8 segments, each labeled with a virtue: patience, clarity, obedience, silence, detachment, memory, balance, and absence. The 8th is the most curious. Not an ideal to pursue, but a state to accept. Historians have long assumed these were meditative guides, perhaps spiritual exercises modeled after monastic contemplation, but the pattern is more precise than that. In multiple cases across Europe, you find carvings or writings that depict similar progressions. Not across land, but across roles. Knights becoming watchers, watchers becoming guides. Guides vanishing altogether, their names struck from records, their symbols removed from tombs. The shift is also documented in behavior. One knight in Aragon, noted for his bravery and discipline, suddenly withdrew from command, gave up all visible rank, and was seen only in the company of scribes and architects for the rest of his life. No disgrace accompanied his retreat. On the contrary, records suggest he gained more influence, issuing orders indirectly, often relayed through third parties. When asked why he no longer wore the mantle, he is said to have replied, "I carry what cannot be seen." The same theme emerges in a preserved letter from Portugal, where a younger knight writes to a superior, asking how to become more than brother but less than name. The reply, partly decoded from cipher, simply states, "When you hear silence and obey it, you will know. No signature, no seal. Just the triangle of dots in the corner." The inner pilgrimage seems to have served as an unofficial ascension, not to higher command in the military sense, but to something more abstract. A station of trust, a state of erasure. These men, if they were still considered knights, began to operate without titles, without robes, and without attachments to physical sites. They traveled often alone, left no logs, and when they reappeared, they did so with uncanny influence. Men of few words to whom even the most senior commanders listened with quiet attentiveness. This may also explain why so many of the figures tied to the hidden command structure do not appear in lists of promotions, council elections, or battlefield appointments. They were not elevated by public ceremony. They transitioned through passage, through the inner path. A controversial theory among fringe scholars suggests that this pilgrimage was not merely symbolic, but involved a series of actual tests, mental, spiritual, perhaps even ritualized. These could include isolation, exposure to forbidden texts, or immersion in symbolic architecture rooms constructed for resonance light, or even disorientation. The so-called mirror chambers mentioned in several forgotten accounts may have been part of this process. Rooms designed not to show your reflection, but to remove it. In one extraordinary account from a Templar site in Hungary, a monk writes of a visitor who spent 3 days inside a sealed chamber. When he emerged, he was barefoot shaven and would speak only one phrase for the rest of his life: "I serve what serves." No further explanation. He was not expelled. He was promoted. This deeply esoteric current within the order never made it into the chronicles of Rome or the rage of the Inquisition, perhaps because it didn't threaten theology, it threatened hierarchy. It suggested that true authority came not from appointment, but from disappearance. Not from names, but from the willingness to let the name fall away. And maybe that's what frightened the church most. Not the gold, not the rituals, but the idea that the real power of the Templars lived in the men who stopped being visible long before the fires began. The inner pilgrimage wasn't a path to glory. It was a slow erosion of identity until only duty remained. The final sign of initiation was not a sword, but silence. It doesn't end with exile, or arrest, or death. For those who entered the second circle of command, those hidden men who never bore official rank, there existed a final chilling procedure: disappearance by design. Not vanishing into myth or memory, but into a protocol so precise, so deliberate, it left almost no trace behind. No graves, no wills, no relics passed on to kin, just absence. As if these men were never meant to be found by friend or foe. The first real evidence of such a system comes from a sealed letter found beneath a loose stone in the ruins of the commandery at La Rochelle. dated months before the Templar arrests in France, it outlines a contingency plan should the veil be lifted by force. The letter's final line reads, "Begin the last steps, cross the flame, erase the edge." What that meant wasn't known until other documents began to surface with the same phrasing. It was code. And what it described was both terrifying and brilliant. The protocol consisted of 3 stages: disengagement, displacement, and dissolution. At each phase, the individual would be removed further from the visible world, cutting ties not just with the order, but with identity itself. Disengagement meant severing all direct duties. This was not as simple as walking away, it was a reassignment to nowhere. A knight would vanish from ledgers, his stipend transferred to a nameless account, his correspondence rerouted or destroyed. No formal discharge, just silence. In one chapter house record, a knight's name is crossed out not with ink, but with a pressed seal, a triangle surrounding 3 small stars. No comment, no explanation, just fulfilled. Displacement came next. The individual would be relocated, often outside known Templar holdings. There are references in scattered merchant notes to strange cloaked figures, boarding ships under aliases, or arriving at remote ports with sealed documents requesting no questions. One Venetian harbor log lists a single word, beside a departing traveler nomen, Latin for name. Not a name, but the concept of one. A placeholder, a ghost. And then came dissolution. This was not physical death. It was informational annihilation. The man's records were erased, not merely hidden, but purged. His letters were collected and burned, mentions in meeting minutes redacted. If he had family, they were instructed to say he had died abroad. In one chilling account, a knight's name was carved off a stone wall so cleanly that even the tool marks were polished away. It wasn't revenge, it was reverence. The belief that power without identity was the purest form of loyalty. We see traces of this in Vatican correspondence long after the order's fall. In a memo between cardinals reviewing confiscated Templar archives, one bishop notes that certain roles must have been abandoned entirely, for no successors exist, and no records indicate they ever did. That's not absence, that's elimination. There are even whispers in the Carthusian monastic orders, solitary, silent, deliberately apolitical, of former Templars, arriving not as converts, but as emissaries. Men who asked nothing, claimed nothing, but observed everything. One abbot described his visitor as a man without breath, yet filled with fire. What makes the disappearance protocol so difficult to study is precisely what made it effective. It didn't leave a footprint. It left a vacuum, a strategic non-presence. The only way to detect it is through the shape of what's missing, like noticing the outline of a vanished statue from the dust it left behind. It wasn't used for every knight, not even most. But for the few who bore secrets too dangerous to let die publicly, or too sacred to let fall into enemy hands, this was the last rite. A burial without death, a sacrifice of identity, not life. Even centuries later, the echoes remain. A tomb in England bears a Templar cross, but no name. Inside, a single inscription, "Gone to serve," where names are chains. In a mountain chapel in Italy, 3 triangular holes are carved into the altar stone with no accompanying text. And in the private collection of a 19th century archivist, a small leather pouch contains a page of Latin written in a trembling hand, "I go where memory fails, so that purpose may not." This was not martyrdom. This was design. The ultimate act of devotion by men who knew that to protect the flame, they must become its shadow. They didn't disappear by accident. They disappeared on command. By the time the Knights Templar were officially dissolved, The world had already begun to reshape itself. Monarchies consolidated power. The church adjusted its grip. New orders rose, some religious, some military, many more obscure. But as you begin to sift through the charters, rules, and rituals of these emerging groups, you find something disquieting. They speak with borrowed voices. They wear new banners, but old patterns. And hidden just beneath the surface of many of these institutions is a familiar imprint, the mark of men who had already learned how to lead from the shadows. Start with the Order of Christ in Portugal. It's often presented as a pragmatic solution, a convenient way to absorb Templar assets without provoking Rome's wrath. Former knights were quietly repurposed, their lands transferred, their customs retained. But a closer look reveals something more deliberate. The first Grand Master of the Order of Christ, Gil Martins, was a former Templar, personally cleared, never charged. The structure of the new order remained almost identical, and within its earliest preserved documents are references not just to continuity, but to legacy. The fire has moved, but it has not dimmed. One of the most telling clues appears in the architectural plans of the Convento de Cristo in Tomar. Its design includes not only a central rotunda modeled after the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but hidden corridors and side chapels that mirror structures found in former Templar sites in Cyprus and northern France. One chamber in particular, buried beneath the main altar, contains a stone basin surrounded by symbols not recognized in any Catholic tradition, but echoing with eerie precision the ciphered commandments of the Second Circle. In Spain, the Order of Montesa was similarly created to absorb Templar remnants. Yet its early financial records show large sums moved through unnamed agents. One ledger lists outflows to brothers beyond the fold, an exact phrase found a century earlier in ciphered Templar documents. The handwriting in that margin is different, the ink faded, but the voice is unmistakable. Then there are the less official groups. In the Rhineland, a short-lived society known as the Guardians of the Path flourished quietly for 2 generations. Their rites involved silent vigils, geometric meditation, and the study of ancient symbols, many of which align with markings found in the sealed chambers beneath Templar ruins. One initiation hymn recovered from their archives includes the line, "We follow the unseen road where the first house ended." The phrase "first house" is found in only one other place, carved into the keystone of a collapsed arch near La Rochelle, over what was once believed to be a treasury vault. Even more curious is the appearance of the triadic dot symbol, the Triangle of Silence. Long considered lost, it begins to reappear in the unlikeliest places: the ceremonial rings of a merchant guild in Bruges, the frescoes in a disused chapel in Sicily, etched into the blade of a dagger belonging to a 15th century Hungarian nobleman who left behind no descendants, but pages of letters addressed only to the flame that moves. Historians, of course, dismiss most of these links. They chalk it up to coincidence, the long shadow of myth, or the human tendency to assign patterns to noise. But when the same phrases, the same symbols, the same organizational oddities surface in places and times far removed from one another, the probability of accident begins to crumble. It's not just the groups themselves, it's their structure. You notice it in the way decisions are deferred to unseen councils, how initiates are separated from information by layers of abstraction. Some of these orders didn't seek visibility, they avoided it. They functioned efficiently, strategically, and always in silence. One particularly strange example emerges from a 17th century fraternity in Prague. Little is known about them, no official name survives. But a notebook kept by a local printer who witnessed their meetings records their protocols, a circle of 7 no-leader decisions made only in consensus. Members wore no marks, except a ring with 3 dots. The printer, skeptical at first, eventually burned his press after printing what he described as a line that should not be read aloud. These were not Templars. not in name, not in creed. But they carried something forward, an echo of the structure, the philosophy, and the mission. Perhaps even the same code, passed mouth to mouth, generation to generation. In the Masonic tradition, certain rites bear uncanny resemblance to those once described in the early Templar chapters. Rituals involving light silence and passage through veils. A Scottish rite includes a moment of reflection, called the Watcher's Pause. A French variation ends with the line, "What is unseen governs the scene." Coincidence, perhaps, or perhaps not. Because if you were part of a group that knew how to operate without names, without titles, without formal recognition, you wouldn't need to start a new order. You'd only need to ensure that the next one remembered the shape of yours. This is the mask. Not a disguise of intent, but of lineage. These weren't fanatics clinging to a lost cause. They were custodians, engineers of continuity, builders of structures that could move across time without being torn down. And the mask worked. Because even now, centuries later, when you walk through certain halls, when you hear certain phrases, when you see the quiet deference given to a man whose name is never spoken, you wonder, does he know, or is he still being guided? It was discovered beneath the rubble of a ruined priory, in what was once the damp, lightless cellar of a Templar compound. Time had stripped the stone of its sharpness, and the roof had collapsed inward long ago. But among the debris beneath moss-covered flagstones and centuries of silence, a narrow shaft led downward into a chamber that had escaped both fire and record. And there, within a rusted metal box wrapped in wax-drenched wool, lay a single codex. It was not ornate. The leather cover was plain, though worn smooth from touch. The script inside was careful, precise, without embellishment. Its pages, miraculously preserved by the dry earth, offered no miracles, no prophecy, no blueprint for rebellion or revenge. Instead, it read like the final breath of someone who had lived entirely in the margins. Not a leader by title, not a saint. Just a man whose hands had touched the true pulse of something that never wanted a name. The writer does not sign as Commander or Grand Master. He doesn't even use a name. He refers to himself only once, and simply as servant to the circle. And from the tone you understand that this circle is not metaphorical. It is not poetic. It is real. A governing body so hidden, so diffuse, that even its members were forbidden to speak its shape aloud. He begins with a lament, not for the fall of the order, but for its visibility. He writes, "What we lost was not power, but discretion." The purge, he claims, did not wound them because it came from kings or popes. It wounded them because it forced them into the light. Our strength was never in the sword or the vault, but in the silence between them. It was never our gold, they feared it was our vanishing. There's a passage about Acre written in the past tense, yet heavy with immediacy. He describes how in the days after the siege, those who had no name were not hunted. They passed through checkpoints unchallenged because no one was looking for what didn't officially exist. They wore no sigils, carried no charters. And when they reached the coast, they boarded ships that were not listed on any manifest. Ghosts do not buy passage, he writes. They are carried by memory and tide. The codex is laced with gentle bitterness, not toward those who betrayed the order, but toward those who mistook its essence. He chides the chroniclers who obsessed over titles and land grants. He mourns the knights who believed valor lived only in banners and war horses. And then, with a kind of quiet pride, he records the names of those who held no place in any hierarchy, but who shaped outcomes with the lightest of touches. He describes one man who traveled between safe houses disguised as a tinker, who delivered messages not in parchment, but in carved patterns of wear on the handles of tools. Another who served as a lay brother in an abbey, but who during specific feast days disappeared for hours, returning with dust on his robe and new ink in the margins of the abbey's old books. These were the servants of the circle. Their allegiance wasn't to land or lord, but to the continuation of something older. In one particularly arresting paragraph, the author explains the circle's foundational rule. To be obeyed, you must not command. To endure, you must not be seen. To remember, you must let the world forget you. It's not a motto. It's a strategy. And it worked. The Codex ends not with revelation, but with release. The final page holds a single sentence. If you are reading this, then I am dust, and the circle has become the horizon. It's not a farewell. It's a transformation. A signal that what was once structured and guarded has now become diffuse, invisible, maybe even atmospheric. No coordinates, no treasure, no vengeance, just the final voice of someone who knew too well that the greatest power lies in absence, that the best commanders don't leave statues or tombs, but currents, nudges, invisible fingers on the scale of history. And when you close the Codex, whether literally or just in your mind's eye, you're left not with closure, but with a slow, spreading chill. Because if even a few of these accounts are true, then the story of the Templars doesn't end at the stake or in the vaults. It doesn't even end at all. It continues. In shadows, in structures, in silence. And the last message wasn't written for followers. It wasn't written to inspire. It was written as a warning. Not to fear the men with titles, but the ones who never needed them. It wasn't a relic, not in the traditional sense, not a chalice or a sword or even a book wrapped in coded verses. What the hidden commanders protected was older than any Grail legend, more enduring than the walls of any fortress. It had no weight, no gleam, no edges to polish. And yet it was the most dangerous thing the Templar Order ever possessed. It was a pattern. A way of seeing the world not through conquest, but through continuity. These shadow figures weren't guardians of a single treasure, but of a network, a language, a method of survival. Their work was not about hoarding something tangible, but about sustaining something incorruptible. Because the greatest threat to any power is not resistance, it's memory. And what they feared most was that someone might remember a different kind of power, one that did not need kings or popes or even names. Across the prior chapters, you've followed the echoes of these men through records they weren't supposed to leave, through safe houses no charter mentioned, through decisions where they sat behind the men who held the titles. But here finally, we ask why. Why go to such lengths? Why create an entire class of commanders who would never be acknowledged, never honored, and never written into history because they weren't protecting a secret? They were the secret. The Templar structure publicly was linear. Grand Master, Seneschal, regional commanders. It mirrored feudal systems, hierarchies, but beneath it, or perhaps beside it, there existed a second system, not feudal but circular, non-linear, flexible, designed not to grow but to last. The circle, as hinted in the Codex, wasn't just a governing council. It was a philosophy, one that believed institutions only survive when their core is invisible. That's why the known Templar leadership was allowed to shine so brightly it drew the fire. When Clement V and Philip IV moved against the order, they struck at what was visible: land wealth and men in robes. And in doing so, they missed the quiet transfer of continuity that had already taken place. Before the arrests began, before the vaults were sealed, a shadow current moved. Documents vanished. Funds were rerouted. Contacts across Scotland, Aragon, and Cyprus were activated not by command, but by habit, ritual, instinct. No orders needed issuing. The Circle had prepared for this for generations. They weren't just protecting themselves. They were protecting a cultural DNA, a template of how to survive collapse. A model for how to embed into other systems, hide within them, and quietly steer them from the inside. Not as a conspiracy to dominate, but as a hedge against forgetting, against chaos, against tyranny. And there's evidence this survival model worked. After the Templar suppression, similar command patterns appear in at least 4 major spiritual or military orders. You see them in the internal councils of the Knights of Christ in Portugal, in the esoteric structures of the Scottish Freemasons, in the secret deliberation processes of certain Renaissance city-states that managed to remain independent for centuries while empires rose and fell around them. Different names, same bones. The Circle's gift wasn't a horde, it was resilience, and that's much harder to destroy. Even within the Vatican archives, there are hints that the Church suspected this deeper layer of endurance. One papal report from 1320 notes with clear frustration that despite the decapitation of the order's leadership, operations of unknown nature persist among certain knightly outposts, loyal to no bishop, answering no summons. Another bishop wrote, "It is as though the tree were cut, yet roots bloom elsewhere." The hidden commanders weren't merely strategic masterminds. They were gardeners, cultivators of an idea that had to live without borders or branding. Their goal was not glory, it was germination, and in that sense they were wildly successful. What they protected was an architecture of survival so good, so efficient, that even now, centuries later, we can only guess at its full shape. The true brilliance of their legacy is that we may never find it fully. Only brush against it, catch glimpses in patterns, feel its presence in institutions that seem too fluid to pin down, too quiet to grasp. In a world obsessed with monuments and names carved in stone, these men chose vapor, intention over inscription, legacy over credit. And that perhaps is why they succeeded where so many others failed. What they protected wasn't a thing. It was a way. A design so subtle, so self-erasing, that it left no map, only momentum, and it is still moving. You try to remember their names, but there were none. You trace the records, the ledgers, the painted panels of history, but they left no image. You study the maps, the archives, the ruins, and the silence is not accidental, it is cultivated. Because the greatest commanders of the Knights Templar were never meant to be known. They were meant to be felt. Not as titles, not as statues, but as a drift in the course of events. A quiet correction in a world too loud with power and pride. They moved through the margins, through meetings held by candlelight, through whispers at border crossings, through encoded prayers sewn into the hem of a robe. And when the vaults were broken and the banners burned, their work remained because it was never built on stone. It was built on choice, on discipline, on the refusal to be seen. These were not men of legend. They avoided it. Not saints, not martyrs, not even rebels. Just minds and hands that knew when to stay still and when to act without witness. They held no swords aloft in paintings. They died without epitaphs. And yet somehow their absence shaped what came next more than any victory. Because when the world forgets your face, it also forgets how to hunt you. And so they endured, beneath other names, in the folds of new orders, in gestures passed from father to son, from mentor to apprentice. Their command was not shouted. It was offered like a torch with no flame, just warmth, enough to guide, never to blind. And now, as the dust of this story settles in your mind, you begin to see them. Not as ghosts, not as conspirators, but as a kind of architecture behind the curtain. Never complete, never static, but always there. And maybe that's the final truth. That history doesn't always crown the loudest. Sometimes it bows quietly, unknowingly to the ones who vanish when you look. They're not coming back. They never really left. And you were never meant to find them, only to notice the shape of the silence they left behind. So sleep now, listener. Let the old halls fade. Let the torchlight dim. There's no more parchment to unroll, no more codes to break. The circle has closed. The shadows have receded. And what remains is stillness and breath and the hush of an ending not quite explained. Let your eyes close slowly now. Let the names that were never written drift like ash on a cold wind. You have seen what they never showed, and that is enough. Good night.